close your eyes. It is late. The fire has burned down to a soft glow of embers, and the world outside your window has grown still. There's a quietness that settles over things at this hour, a kind of hush that makes even the most ordinary sounds seem far away. And yet, if you could lean your ear toward the past, if you could strain just a little, you might hear something else. Not the hum of a distant highway or the murmur of a neighbor's television, but the slow, steady trickle of water over stone, the rustle of coarse linen, the low grunt of a man lifting a heavy hide. This is the sound of a life that ran on a different clock, a life built around the most basic of tasks, the most stubborn of materials. This is the world of the medieval tanner. Now, I should warn you, this is not a clean story. It is not a story of polished armor or soaring cathedrals, at least not directly. It is a story of skin and bone, of riverbanks and oak bark, of hands that were never quite free of the smell of decay. And that smell, let us speak of it gently, for it was not a cruel smell, not really, just a constant one. It clung to the tanner's clothes, his hair, his breath. It seeped into the walls of his house, the wood of his tools, the very soil beneath his feet. To the people of the medieval town, that smell was a warning. It told them that the tanner lived there, that his work was close, and that they should perhaps hold their noses or simply walk the other way. But to the tanner himself, the smell was just the scent of a livelihood. It was the smell of leather in the making, of a craft that turned something dead and slippery into something strong and lasting. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a small English town, sometime in the 13th century. The year does not matter much. The rhythms of tanning changed very little for hundreds of years. It is early morning, just before dawn. The air is cool and damp, carrying the taste of wood smoke from 100 chimneys. You can see the river, a dark ribbon winding past the town's boundary, and along its bank, a cluster of low buildings that seem to lean into the water as if they are thirsty. These are the tanneries. They are not pretty. They are made of rough timber and stone, patched with clay and moss, and they sit there like old, patient animals. A few men are already moving about, their breath clouding in the chill. They wear tunics of coarse wool, stained and patched, and their sleeves are rolled up to the elbow. Their arms are red and raw from the cold. One of them, let us call him Thomas, kneels beside a long pit sunk into the earth. The pit is lined with wood and filled with a brownish liquid that smells sharp and sour. This is the lime pit. Thomas reaches in with his bare hands and pulls out a cowhide that has been soaking for days. The hair is slipping from the skin, loosened by the lime, and he scrapes it away with a dull knife, working in long, steady strokes. He does not hurry. There is no point in hurrying. The work will take as long as it takes, and there is always more waiting. He has done this 1,000 times, 10,000 times, and his movements have that slow, almost meditative quality of a task that lives in the hands rather than the head. The cold water is a constant companion. Every tanner knows the sting of it, especially in winter, when ice sometimes forms on the surface of the pits, and he has to break it with a stick before he can work. His fingers grow numb, then painful, then numb again. He might wrap strips of wool around his hands, but they quickly become soaked and useless. So he endures. He breathes in the sharp air, the smell of lime and hide and river mud, and he keeps working. There is no complaint. Complaint is a luxury that belongs to people who have a choice, and Thomas has no choice. This is what he does. This is what his father did, and his father before him. The trade runs in the blood, passed down like a heavy coat that you can never take off. Now you might wonder why anyone would choose such a life. Why not become a baker, with the warm, comforting smell of bread, or a carpenter, with the clean scent of sawdust? But the answer is a simple one, and it is the same answer that drives most human labor, necessity. Leather was everywhere in the medieval world. It was shoes and boots, belts and pouches, saddles and harnesses, gloves and aprons, book covers and bellows, buckets and bottles. Anything that needed to be tough and flexible, that needed to last through rain and mud and hard use, was made of leather. And leather came from the tanner. Without him, the farmer could not plow, because his harness would fall apart. The soldier could not march, because his boots would rot. The scholar could not read, because his books would crumble. The tanner was invisible, but he held the world together, one stinking hide at a time. Let us follow Thomas through the rest of his morning. After the lime pit, he moves to the next station, a large wooden trough filled with running water. He drapes the hide over a beam and begins to work it with a tool called a fleshing knife, a curved blade with handles at both ends. He pushes and pulls, scraping away the fat and muscle that cling to the underside. The flesh comes off in strips, pale and glistening, and he tosses them into a bucket. They will be boiled down into glue or fed to the dogs. Nothing is wasted. The hide itself is still stiff and rough, but already it is beginning to look like something that could become leather. The water in the trough comes from the river, and it is cold, always cold. In the summer, it is bearable, though the flies are a torment. In the winter, it is a kind of slow torture. Thomas's hands are cracked and bleeding, not from the knife, but from the constant wet, the constant cold. He does not think about it. He thinks about the hide, about the next step, about the pile of bark he needs to grind for the tanning pits. The bark, usually oak, is crushed into a coarse powder and soaked in water to make a brown liquor that will slowly turn the raw skin into leather. This is the longest part of the process. Hides can soak in the tanning pits for months, even a year, depending on their thickness. The tanner has to tend them, turning them, adding fresh bark liquor, checking for rot. It is a slow, patient work, a conversation with time itself. And now, a word about the smell, because it is impossible to talk about tanners without talking about the smell, and I want to be kind about it. It was not a single smell, but a symphony of smells. There was the ammonia bite of urine, which was used to soften hides. There was the sourness of lime, the sweetness of rotting flesh, the earthy musk of oak bark, the metallic tang of blood. There was the smell of smoke from the fire that boiled the fat, and the smell of damp wool from the tanner's own clothes. All of these blended together into something that was not entirely unpleasant if you grew up with it, but that could stop a stranger in his tracks. The medieval city was full of strong smells, of course. Open sewers, fish markets, tanneries, all mixed together in a haze that the modern nose would find overwhelming. But even among all that, the tanner's smell was distinctive. It marked him. It kept him at the edge of the community, physically and socially. His house and workshop were required by law to be outside the town walls, downstream from the well, so that his refuse did not poison the drinking water. He lived on the margins, which sounds lonely, but perhaps it was also a kind of freedom. He had his own patch of riverbank, his own rhythm, his own world. Let us step inside Thomas's home for a moment, if you will. It is a small cottage, sharing a wall with his workshop. The door is low, and you have to stoop to enter. Inside, it is dim and smoky. A fire burns in a central hearth, and the smoke curls upward, finding its way out through a hole in the roof. There is no chimney. The walls are bare, except for a few pegs holding clothes and tools. A bed of straw and wool sits in one corner, and a rough wooden table with 2 stools in the center. A pot of porridge simmers over the fire, and the smell of oats mingles with the ever-present smell of the workshop. It is not a warm smell exactly, but it is familiar. Thomas's wife, Alice, is stirring the pot. She is wearing a dress of heavy wool dyed a faded brown, and her hands are red too, from washing clothes in the same cold river. She does not complain either. She knows that her husband's work is her work, that the smell on his skin is the smell of their survival. They eat their meal in silence. The porridge is thin, stretched out with a little milk if they are lucky. There is bread, hard and dark, made from barley and rye. There is a small piece of cheese, maybe, but not always. It is not a feast, but it is enough, and they are grateful. After the meal, Thomas returns to the pits, and Alice takes up her own tasks. She scrapes and cleans the smaller pieces of hide, the ones that will become gloves or purses. She ties them in bundles for drying. She is a tanner too, in her own quiet way. The whole household is bound to the trade. The hours pass slowly. The sun climbs, then begins to fall. The work goes on. There is no bell to mark the end of the day, no clock to measure time. The tanner works until the light fades, until his back aches and his hands are too stiff to hold the knife. Then he washes his arms in the river, the cold water shocking the skin back to life, and he walks back to the cottage, his footsteps heavy in the mud. He sits by the fire, eating a supper of bread and pottage, and then he lies down on the straw bed. He is asleep almost before his head touches the pillow. He dreams of nothing or of leather. There is no time for dreaming. And this was the pattern day after day, year after year. It was a life of endless work, yes, but it was also a life of deep, unhurried purpose. The tanner did not work faster than he had to. He worked at the pace of the hides, the pace of the seasons, the pace of the sun. He was bound to the earth in a way that we, with our electric lights and digital screens, can hardly imagine. The cold water and the smell and the weariness were all part of the bargain. And maybe, in the quiet of his long days, there was a contentment that we have lost, a simple satisfaction in turning a raw, bloody thing into something that would carry a man for 1,000 miles. Let us stay here a while, on this riverbank, in this medieval world. Let us let the sounds of the water and the scrape of the knife wash over us. The fire crackles. The moon rises. The tanner works on, silent and steady, as he has for 1,000 years before, and as he would for 1,000 more if time allowed. But time does not allow. The world changes, and so, slowly, we will pull away from this scene, back toward the present, toward the warmth of your own room, the softness of your pillow. But the tanner remains there in the past, his hands in the cold water, his breath in the night air, enduring. And so the night deepens, and the stars wheel overhead. Thomas sleeps, but the work does not truly sleep. The hides in the pits continue their slow transformation, soaking in the bark liquor, the tannins binding to the collagen molecule by molecule. It is a chemistry that no one in the 14th century understood, not in the way we do now, but they knew it as a kind of magic, a patience paid in months. The moon rises higher, and the river catches its light, a silver shimmer over the black water. The tanner's cottage is dark, the fire banked to embers. The only sound is the occasional splash of a fish, or the cry of an owl from the woods beyond the fields. It is a peaceful sound, if you can forget the smell. But the smell is part of the peace now. It has settled into the air, into the mud, into the very wood of the buildings, as familiar as the sound of the river itself. Let us wake with Thomas before dawn. The sky is still dark, but a faint gray is creeping over the eastern hill. He stirs on his bed of straw, his joints stiff, his hands aching. He does not groan. He does not stretch. He simply rises, pulling his tunic over his head, and steps into his boots, which are damp from yesterday. He goes outside to the river bank and washes his face in the cold water, and the shock of it is enough to open his eyes fully. He looks at the sky, judging the weather. It will be a clear day, cold but dry, good for working the hides that need to dry. He walks to the pits, lifting the weighted boards to check on the older hides, the ones that have been soaking since the spring. He presses a finger to the surface, feeling the softness, the give. They are nearly ready. Another few weeks, maybe, and they will be taken out, washed, and hung to dry in the shed. Then they will be softened by working them over a wooden beam, a process called staking, which takes endless patience. He nods to himself, satisfied. Now, you might wonder how Thomas knows when a hide is done. There is no timer, no gauge. It is a knowledge that lives in the hands, in the nose, in the eyes. The hide changes color, from a pale, sickly white to a warm, golden brown. It becomes less like a piece of an animal and more like a fabric. It loses the greasy feel and gains a firm, clean texture. And there is a smell, a subtle shift from the sour scent of raw hide to the rich, earthy smell of leather. Thomas knows this smell the way a baker knows the smell of bread. He breathes it in, and he is content. The morning sun is just peeking over the trees as he begins his first task of the day. He has a stack of fresh hides that arrived yesterday from the butcher, piled in a cart. They are still wet with salt and blood, and they must be soaked in the river overnight to rehydrate them. He carries them one by one to the water, wading in up to his thighs, the cold biting his skin. He weights them with stones so that the current can wash away the salt. It is a simple job, but it takes time, and his breath comes in puffs of white steam. The river is alive with the morning. A kingfisher flashes past, blue and orange, and a heron stands motionless further downstream, watching. Thomas does not notice. He is focused on the hides, on the water, on the rhythm of his work. You might also wonder about the other tanners on the riverbank. There are several, each with their own patch of ground, their own pits, their own rhythm. They do not talk much. The work does not allow for chatter. But there is a kind of camaraderie in the shared labor, in the cold water and the smell and the long hours. Sometimes one of them will raise a hand in greeting, and Thomas will nod back. Sometimes they will help each other lift a heavy hide or share a piece of bread at midday. But mostly they work alone, each man in his own bubble of steam and effort. Let us move forward a few hours to the time when the sun is high enough to warm the air just a little. Thomas has finished his morning routine. He has scraped the flesh from 3 hides, and his arms are streaked with fat and blood. He stands by the fire, where a large pot of water is heating. He will add oak bark, ground into a coarse powder, and let it steep to make a fresh batch of tanning liquor. The bark comes from the forest, collected in the spring when the sap is rising, and it must be dried and stored in a dry shed. It is another task that stretches across the year, another thread in the tapestry of his life. He pours the hot water into a wooden trough and then adds the bark, stirring it with a long wooden paddle. The water turns brown, a deep, dark brown like strong tea, and the smell rises, sharp and astringent. It is a good smell, the smell of the work itself, the promise of leather. He plunges a hide into the trough, forcing it down with the paddle, making sure every inch is covered. He lays a board on top and weights it with stones. Then he does the same with the next hide, and the next, until all the fresh ones are soaking. Now they will sit for weeks, for months. He wipes his hands on his apron, which is stiff with dried liquor and fat, and he looks at the line of pits. Each one holds a different batch, a different stage. It is like a calendar, but written in skin and bark and water. The afternoon passes slowly. Thomas moves from pit to pit, checking, turning, adding fresh liquor. Sharpens his knife on a whetstone, a soothing, rhythmic sound. He eats a piece of bread and a hunk of cheese, sitting on a log by the fire. The crows gather on the roof of the shed, watching him. They know he sometimes throws scraps. He tosses them a piece of gristle, and they squabble over it. The world is small, and it is enough. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about the seasons, because the tanner's life was shaped by them in ways that are hard for us to feel today. We live in a climate-controlled world. We forget that the medieval tanner could not work in the deep winter if the river froze. He could not tan if the bark was not harvested in spring. He could not finish leather if the air was too damp. His work was a dance with the weather, and he had to listen. In the spring, he would be busy collecting bark, and the hides from the winter slaughter would be stiff and difficult. In the summer, the heat would make the smell worse, and the flies would swarm, but the river was warm and the tanning went faster. In the autumn, he would prepare the pits for the long winter, making sure he had enough bark and water to last. And in the winter, he would do the finer work, the cutting and the stitching, by the fire. It was a cycle as old as the hills. Let us follow Thomas into the late afternoon when the light begins to slant and the shadows lengthen. He has a special task today. A customer has come, a saddler from the next village, who needs a thick hide for a horse collar. Thomas leads him to the shed where the finished leather is stored, stacked in piles, smooth and rich. The saddler runs his hand over the surface, feeling the grain, the thickness. He nods. He pays in coin, a rare treat. Thomas will save the coin for a new axe, or maybe a warm cloak for Alice. The transaction is quiet, almost solemn. There is no bargaining, no chatter. Each man knows the value of a good hide. After the saddler leaves, Thomas stands for a moment in the shed, looking at his work. The leather gleams in the low light. He remembers each hide, each animal, each step. The cow that gave this hide was a black and white one from the farm down the lane. He had seen it grazing a year ago. Now it is here, transformed, ready to become part of a horse's life. There is a strange poetry in it, a kind of continuity that reaches beyond death. Does not think in those words, but he feels it, a quiet satisfaction. The sun sets and the cold returns. He washes in the river once more, the water now feeling almost warm compared to the evening air. He walks to the cottage, where Alice has a stew simmering. The smell of herbs and vegetables mixes with the leather smell, and for a moment they are indistinguishable. They eat together, a simple meal, and then they sit by the fire. Alice mends a torn shirt. Thomas whittles a peg for a broken handle. They do not speak, but the silence is comfortable, as worn as an old shoe. And so the day ends, as all days end, in the quiet darkness. The tanner sleeps, and the river flows, and the hides soak, and the world turns. Tomorrow will be another day, much the same, but with small differences. A new hide, a different bark, a shift in the wind. The work will go on, endless and fundamental. Let us stay here, in this small cottage, by this crackling fire. Let the warmth seep into your bones. Let the sound of the river become a lullaby. The tanner's life is not a story of grand adventure, but of steady endurance, of hands that keep working even when they hurt, of a heart that finds peace in the familiar stink and the cold water. He does not ask for more, and maybe in this quiet moment we can understand him a little, and maybe we can find a little of that peace for ourselves as we drift toward sleep. The night grows deeper. The fire burns down to embers. The wind picks up, rustling the thatch on the roof. Thomas turns in his bed, pulling the blanket tighter. In the other room, the hides wait, patient and silent. And outside, the river continues its endless song, a song that has been sung for centuries and will be sung for centuries more, long after the tanner's hands are dust and his leather has crumbled away and his cottage is nothing but a memory under the grass. But the river remains, and the work remains, in the story we tell now, in the quiet of your own room, as you close your eyes and let the sound of my voice carry you into the sleep of the just, the tired, the ones who have done their honest work. And so we rest, and so we rest. But even in rest, the work of the world does not stop. The river continues its slow, patient flow, carrying with it the memory of the day's toil. The hides in the pits sink a little deeper into the brown liquor, the bark doing its quiet, chemical work. The embers in the fire settle, and the wind shifts, bringing a new scent from the woods, pine and damp earth. Thomas sleeps, and Alice sleeps, and the cottage breathes. And perhaps, in that breathing, we can feel the rhythm of 1,000 such nights, stretching back into the deep past. Let me tell you now about the winter. Not the winter of a single year, but the winter that comes every year, like a great, slow wave. The tanner knows it is coming long before the first frost. He sees it in the way the leaves turn, in the way the river runs colder, in the way his own hands begin to ache at night. He prepares. He stacks the bark in the dry shed, layer upon layer, until the room is filled with the sharp, woody smell. He checks the pits, making sure the liquors are strong enough to carry through the months when the river might freeze. He repairs the roof of the shed, and the cottage, and the hen house. He sharpens every blade, and he oils every tool. It is a quiet, methodical urgency, like the way a squirrel gathers acorns. There is no panic in it, only a deep, ancient knowing. And then the first snow comes. It falls silently in the middle of the night. Thomas wakes to a different world. The light is changed. The sounds are muffled. The river is still running, but slower, darker, with a thin crust of ice forming along the edges. He pulls on his woolen tunic, his leather apron, his boots, and he steps outside. The snow is deep enough to cover his ankles. He breathes in, and the air is so cold it seems to crackle in his lungs. He walks to the pits. They are not frozen yet. The liquor is thick and dark, and the hides are still submerged. He stirs one with a long pole, and the movement sends up a cloud of vapor. The work continues, but at a slower pace. He cannot scrape hides in the freezing wind. The flesh would freeze before he could remove it. So he focuses on the pits, on the turning, on the watching. On the days when the sun barely rises above the horizon, he stays inside the cottage by the fire. He has a smaller pit there, a wooden trough, for the finer work. He takes a batch of hides that have been soaking for months, and he lays them out on a board. He scrapes them again, this time with a finer blade, removing the last bits of flesh and hair. Then he rubs them with tallow, working it into the grain with his bare hands. The fat is soft and white, and it melts with the warmth of his touch. The leather becomes supple, almost alive. This is the finishing, the part that requires patience and care. He works slowly, one hide at a time, while the fire crackles and Alice spins wool in the corner. The cottage smells of tallow and leather and wood smoke. It is a good smell, a warm smell. I want to tell you about the guild, not as a dry historical fact, but as a living thing, like a broad oak that shelters many creatures. In the town where Thomas sells his leather, there is a guild hall. It is a stone building, not grand, but solid. Inside, once a month, the tanners meet. They are not a large group, perhaps a dozen men, ranging from young apprentices to old masters with gray beards and gnarled hands. They sit on wooden benches around a long table. They talk about the price of bark, about the quality of hides from the autumn slaughter, about a customer who complained that a piece of leather was too thin. They settle disputes. If a tanner has been using too much water or not letting the hides soak long enough, the others will speak up, not harshly, but firmly. There is a code, unwritten, that the work must be done properly, or the reputation of all will suffer. Thomas is not a guild member. He is too far from the town, too independent. But he knows the rules. He respects the men who sit in that hall. Sometimes, when he delivers a finished hide to the saddler, he will stop and watch from a distance as the guild members emerge after their meeting. They talk in low voices, and they nod to each other, and they go their separate ways. There is a dignity in their order. It is a way of saying that the work is not just about survival, but about craft, about honor. And Thomas, standing in the shadow of the guild hall, feels a quiet kinship with them, even though he has never set foot inside. Let me now take you to the spring. The snow melts and the river swells. The world is wet and soft. Thomas goes to the forest to collect bark. He takes a small axe, sharp as a razor. He walks along the old paths between the young oak trees. He chooses the branches that are thick and straight, and he cuts them with a clean stroke. The bark comes off in long strips, curling like ribbons. He stacks them in a basket on his back. The forest is full of birdsong, and the ground is carpeted with wild garlic and bluebells. The air is sweet and damp. He works for hours, his hands stained with sap. He does not take too much from any one tree. That would be foolish, and the guild would frown on it. He is careful, thoughtful. He thinks of the years ahead, of the trees that will still be standing when he is gone. And then there is the matter of the lime. I have not spoken of it yet, because it is a delicate subject, but it belongs here, in the quiet of the story. Lime is used to remove the hair from the hides. It is a harsh substance, made from burned limestone. Tanner mixes it with water in a special pit, and he lowers the hides into it. The lime eats away at the hair roots, and it softens the skin, but it also makes the hides swell, and it releases a smell that is unlike anything else. It is not the bad smell of the river, the smell of decay. It is a chemical smell, sharp and burning. The tanner works with his mouth and nose covered, a cloth tied across his face. He does not linger over the lime pit. He does his work quickly, and then he moves on. The lime is necessary, but it is not pleasant. It is a reminder that the craft of tanning is a kind of negotiation with the elements, a conversation that sometimes turns harsh. You see, the tanner lives at the edge of what is comfortable, at the edge of what is acceptable to the senses. The smell, the cold, the endless work, these are not things he chooses to ignore. They are part of him, woven into his days. And yet, he does not complain. Not in the way we might. He accepts the smell as the smell of his trade, the cold as the cost of living near the river, the work as the price of a steady life. There is a philosophy in that acceptance, a kind of wisdom that is hard to describe. It is the wisdom of the old, of the ones who have learned that struggle is not something to be overcome, but something to be lived day by day, step by step. The days lengthen. The sun grows warmer. The flies return, buzzing around the pits. Thomas uses his hat to wave them away. He does not curse them. They are part of the summer, as sure as the heat. He has a new batch of hides from a cow that died of old age. The hide is thin, not ideal, but he will work with it. He soaks it in the river, the cold water feeling almost pleasant now. He scrapes it and he limed it, and now it is in the bark liquor, slowly turning brown. He checks it every day, lifting the board, feeling the texture, smelling the change. It is a slow transformation, like watching a child grow. You cannot see it from one moment to the next, but over weeks, the hide changes, becoming something new. In the late summer, when the days are long and the air is heavy, Thomas takes a rest. Not a full day. He never takes a full day, but an hour after the midday meal. He sits under the willow tree by the river, his back against the trunk. He closes his eyes. He hears the water, the wind in the leaves, the distant cry of a hawk. He does not think of anything. He simply rests, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. It is a small thing, but it is enough. And then he stands, and he goes back to work. I want to mention the children. Thomas and Alice have no children of their own, but there are children in the village. They are curious about the tanner. They dare each other to come close to the pits. They hold their noses and laugh. The older boys sometimes offer to help for a penny. Thomas lets them fetch water or carry bark. He teaches them how to stir the liquor, how to tell when a hide is ready. He is patient with them, for he knows that one day one of them might take up the trade, or they might not. The choice is theirs. But for now, the work itself is the teacher, and the children learn by watching, by doing, by making mistakes. And Thomas, in his own quiet way, passes on the skills that were passed to him from an older tanner who is now gone, his bones somewhere under the grass. The autumn comes again. The leaves turn amber and red. The river runs low and clear. Thomas looks at his pits, and he sees the work of the whole year spread before him. Hides at every stage, from the fresh to the finished. He knows which are ready to be sold, which need more time, which will become good leather, and which will be only passable. It is a kind of accounting, not with numbers, but with his hands and his eyes and his nose. He is satisfied. Not happy, exactly. That is too strong a word for the quiet contentment he feels. But satisfied, the way a man is satisfied when he has stacked the firewood before the winter, or when he has mended the fence that was broken. The work is done, and it was done well. Let me end this part of the story with the river at night. It is late autumn now, and the stars are sharp and cold. Thomas stands by the edge of the water. He has finished his work for the day. The moon is half full, and it casts a silver light on the ripples. He cannot see the hides in the pits, but he knows they are there, waiting. He thinks of tomorrow, and the day after, and the years after that. He does not think of his own death, not directly, but he feels the weight of time, the way it flows like the river, carrying everything away. And yet the work continues. The leather will outlast him for a while, and then it, too, will return to the earth. He is part of a cycle, a long and patient cycle, and that is enough. He turns and walks back to the cottage. The light from the window is warm and golden. He pushes open the door, and the smell of stew and fire and leather greets him. Alice looks up and smiles. She has no words, but none are needed. He sits down, and he takes the bowl she offers, and he eats, and the world is small and good and endless. And you, my listener, you can rest now, knowing that the tanner is resting too, and that his work and his story will be waiting for you tomorrow if you wish to listen again. And now, my listener, let us stay a while longer in that warm cottage. The fire crackles softly, and the shadows dance on the walls. Thomas finishes his stew, and he sets the bowl aside. He does not rise immediately. He lets the warmth settle in his bones. Alice sits across from him, mending a tear in his tunic. The needle moves with a rhythm that is almost hypnotic, in and out, in and out. The only sounds are the fire and the wind outside, and the occasional creak of the roof beams. It is a small sound, but it is a sound of home, of shelter. Thomas closes his eyes for a moment. He is not sleeping, not quite. He is drifting, the way a leaf drifts on a slow current. He thinks of the hides in the pits, and he knows they are safe. The water will not freeze solid in the pits, not yet, not deep enough. But the cold will slow the curring. That is all right. The leather does not mind waiting. It has its own patience. And Thomas, too, has learned to wait. Waits for the bark to release its tannins. He waits for the lime to do its work. He waits for the hides to become something they were not before. And in the waiting, there is a kind of peace. Let me tell you now about the winter that followed. It was a hard winter, the kind that comes once in a decade. The snow fell early and stayed late. The river froze at the edges, and Thomas had to break the ice every morning to check his pits. He did this with a heavy wooden mallet, striking the ice in a steady rhythm. The sound echoed across the white fields. The birds were gone, and the world was silent except for that thumping. Thump, thump, thump. The ice would crack in a web of lines, and Thomas would scoop the pieces out with a long-handled net. His fingers were red and stiff, but he did not complain. He wrapped them in strips of wool, and he kept working. The cottage became a workshop of sorts. Thomas brought some of the smaller hides inside to keep them from freezing. He hung them near the fire, but not too close. The heat would dry them too quickly, and that would ruin the leather. He had to balance warmth and moisture, a delicate dance. Alice did not mind the extra hides. She had grown used to the smell, the way one grows used to the scent of wood smoke or bread. She would touch the leather as she passed, feeling its texture. She knew which hides were ready and which still needed time. She was a part of the work, even if she did not dip her hands in the pits. In the evenings, Thomas would sit and scrape the hides with a curved knife. It was a slow, careful task. He would hold the hide over his knee, and he would draw the knife across the surface, removing thin layers of flesh and fat. The motion was rhythmic, almost like stroking a cat. He did not rush. He let the blade find its own way. The shavings fell into a basket, and Alice would later use them to feed the fire, or to stuff a cushion, or to make glue. Nothing was wasted. In the tanner's world, everything had a purpose, even the scraps. And so the winter passed, one day at a time. Thomas would go out to the river, break the ice, check the pits. He would come back inside, stamp the snow from his boots, and sit by the fire. He would eat, and he would work, and he would sleep. The days were short, and the nights were long. There was a comfort in that routine, a rhythm that held the chaos of the world at bay. The snow piled high against the walls of the cottage. The wind howled, but inside, the fire burned, and the leather slowly transformed. Now, let me take you to the market. It is spring again, and the roads are muddy. Thomas has a cart full of finished leather. He has worked all winter, and now he has something to sell. He walks beside the cart, his hand on the shafts, guiding the horse. The road is rutted, and the wheels groan. He passes fields that are green with new wheat. He passes a group of children playing with a stick. They wave at him, and he waves back. The sun is warm, but not yet hot. It is a good day for a journey. The market town is not large, but it is busy. Carts and wagons crowd the square. There are stalls selling cloth, pots, bread, meat. There is a man selling knives, their blades gleaming in the sun. There is a woman with a basket of eggs, and a boy with a cage of pigeons. Thomas finds his usual spot, near the corner of the square where the saddlers and the shoemakers come to look. He sets up his display. He spreads the leather on a clean cloth, the hides stacked in neat piles. He has cowhide, calfskin, and a few pieces of goat leather. They are soft and supple, with a deep brown color that comes from the oak bark. He stands behind his wares, and he waits. A shoemaker approaches. He is an old man with a crooked back. He runs his hand over a piece of cowhide, feeling the thickness, the grain. He lifts it to his nose and sniffs. He nods. He asks the price. Thomas tells him, and the shoemaker frowns. He offers less. Thomas shakes his head. They bargain, the way men have bargained for centuries. It is a ritual, almost a dance. In the end, they agree on a price. The shoemaker hands over a handful of coins. Thomas weighs them in his palm, feeling their heft. He counts them twice, though he knows the count already. It is a fair price. He wraps the leather in a piece of linen, and the shoemaker takes it and walks away. Thomas sells most of his leather that day. A saddler takes several pieces for a new saddle. A glover buys some of the soft goat leather. A man who makes belts and straps takes the rest. By late afternoon, Thomas's cart is empty. He has a purse full of coins. He stands in the square, and he feels a quiet satisfaction. He has done his work, and the market has rewarded him. He buys a new knife for his belt, and a length of cloth for Alice to make a dress. He buys a small bag of salt and a jar of honey. He buys a piece of fish, fresh from the river, for their supper. He walks home in the evening, the cart light now, the horse moving briskly. The sun is low, and the shadows stretch across the road. He passes a village where a fiddler is playing, and the sound drifts across the fields. Thomas does not stop, but he nods his head in time to the music. The road is long, and the miles pass slowly, but he does not mind. He is tired, but it is a good tired, the tired of a day well spent. When he reaches his cottage, the door is open. Alice is waiting. She sees the cloth in his hands and she smiles. She takes it and holds it up to the light. She thanks him. They sit together in the doorway, watching the sky turn orange and red. The flies are back, but they do not bother. Thomas tells her about the shoemaker and the saddler and the glover. He tells her about the coins in his purse. She listens and she nods and she asks questions. It is a simple conversation, but it is enough. It is the fabric of their life, woven from small threads, but strong. The summer came and went, and another autumn and another winter. The years passed and the river flowed on. Thomas grew older. His hands became knotted with arthritis, and his back ached in the cold. But he did not stop. He could not stop. The work was his life, and his life was the work. He taught his nephew, a young boy named Richard, to help with the pits. Richard was not strong, but he was willing. He learned to scrape and to stir and to wait. Thomas saw himself in the boy, the same patience, the same quiet devotion. It was a comfort. One evening in the late autumn, Thomas sat by the river. The leaves were falling, and the water was dark and cold. He looked at his hands, the skin cracked and stained. He thought of all the hides he had soaked and limed and tanned. He could not count them. They were beyond counting. They had become shoes and belts and saddles and bags, and they had gone out into the world, carrying goods and people, protecting feet and hands. He had given them a second life, and that was something. He closed his eyes, and he listened to the river. It was the same sound he had heard as a boy, and it would be the same sound when he was gone. Alice came to sit beside him. She did not speak. She took his hand, and they sat together in the gathering dusk. The stars began to appear one by one. The air was cool and still. Thomas felt the weight of his years, but it was not a burden. It was a part of the land, the way the old oak tree holds the memory of storms. He breathed in the smell of the river, the smell of the leather that still rested in the pits. It was the smell of his life, and he was grateful for it. And now, my listener, you can imagine him there by the water, the quiet man who turned raw hides into leather, who worked with the river and the bark and the lime. He did not seek fame or fortune. He sought only to do his work well, to pass on what he knew, to live a life that was honest and full. And in that small life, there was a kind of greatness, the greatness of the ordinary, the sacredness of the everyday. So rest now, if you wish. Let the river of this story carry you gently. The tanner will still be here when you return, and so will his work, and so will the endless cycle of the seasons. But for tonight, let the fire die down, let the world go quiet. In the morning, there will be more hides to check, more bark to gather, more leather to sell. But for now, there is only peace and the soft murmur of the water and the knowledge that the story is not over. It never is. It simply waits, patient as the tanner himself. Good night, my listener. Sleep well. But the morning always comes, even after the most peaceful of nights. And so, it was that Thomas woke to the sound of rain tapping on the thatch, a soft and steady rhythm that promised a quiet day. He lay still for a moment, listening. The fire had burned low, and the cottage was cool. Alice was already up, stirring the embers, coaxing them back to life. She did not speak, and neither did he. There was no need. They had lived together long enough to know each other's movements, each other's silences. Thomas pulled on his tunic and his boots, the same boots he had worn for 3 winters now, the leather soft and worn to the shape of his feet. He walked to the door and looked out. The rain was falling straight down, no wind to drive it. The river was gray and swollen, and the oak trees dripped. It was the sort of day when the world seems to hold its breath, waiting. He decided not to go to the pits that morning. The hides could wait. Instead, he took down a piece of leather from the shelf, a small piece of calfskin that he had kept aside for a special purpose. He wanted to make a new belt for Alice, one with a simple carving, a pattern of leaves and vines. He had learned the craft of leather carving from an old man who had passed through the town years ago, a wandering craftsman who had stayed for a season and taught Thomas a few tricks. Thomas had never forgotten them. He sat down by the fire, the piece of leather on his lap. He wet it slightly with a damp cloth to make it pliable. Then he took his knife, the new one he had bought at the market, and began to trace the design. The blade moved slowly, carefully. He did not rush. The rhythm of the carving was like the rhythm of the rain, steady and soothing. Alice glanced over from her work, but she did not interrupt. She knew better. This was his time, his quiet art. The belt took most of the morning. Thomas worked until the pattern was complete, a delicate tracery of leaves and small flowers. He then rubbed in a little tallow to darken the lines and buffed the surface with a soft cloth. He held it up to the light. It was not perfect, but it was honest work. He smiled and he handed it to Alice. She took it, ran her finger over the carving, and nodded. She did not say thank you with words. She simply put it on, and it fit perfectly. The rain stopped in the afternoon, and the sun broke through the clouds. The world steamed. Thomas opened the door wide to let the fresh air in. The flies were fewer now, the autumn coolness having driven most of them away. He decided to walk down to the river, just to check the pits, even though he had left them alone. He found Richard there, the boy, standing at the edge of the liming pit, a long wooden pole in his hands. Richard was supposed to be stirring the hides, but he was just standing, staring at the water. Thomas came up beside him and looked. There, floating in the lime solution, was a dead rat. It had fallen in sometime during the night, and now it bobbed among the hides, a small, dark shape. Richard looked at Thomas, his eyes wide. He did not know what to do. Thomas sighed. He had seen this before. Animals sometimes fell into the pits, attracted by the smell, and then they could not get out. He fetched a long rake and carefully lifted the rat out. He carried it to the edge of the woods and laid it under a bush. The birds would take care of it. He came back and stood beside Richard. He said, "The lime does not care what it eats, but we do. We must keep the pits clean. You did right to wait." Richard nodded, and he began to stir the hides again, the pole moving in slow circles. Thomas watched him for a moment, then he turned and walked upstream to where the oak bark was stacked. There was a pile of bark from the stripping last spring. and Thomas began to break it into smaller pieces with a wooden mallet. The sound of the mallet on the bark was a dull thud, thud, thud. It was a good sound, a working sound. He filled a basket with the broken bark and carried it to the tanning pit. He sprinkled it over the hides, a layer of bark, then a layer of water, then another layer of bark. The tannin would leach out slowly over weeks, turning the hides into leather. It was slow work, but it was sure. Richard came over and helped him. They worked side by side, the boy and the old man, their hands dusted with bark and lime. The sun was warm now, and the steam rose from the pits, a faint mist that smelled of earth and acid. Richard asked questions, and Thomas answered them, short answers, but true. The boy wanted to know why the bark worked, and Thomas said, "It is the magic of the tree. The tree gives its life to the leather, and the leather gives life to the shoe. It is a trade, a long trade." The afternoon passed, and the light began to slant. Thomas straightened his back and looked at the sky. The clouds were gathering again, gray and low. More rain coming. He told Richard to go home, and the boy left, running up the path, his boots splashing in the puddles. Thomas stayed a moment longer, looking at the pits, at the water, at the slow work of the seasons. He thought of his father, who had taught him this work, and his grandfather, who had taught his father. The line stretched back into the darkness of time, a chain of hands that had held the same tools, smelled the same smells. He was just one link, one small link, but the chain held. He walked home in the dusk. Alice had lit the candles, and the cottage glowed. She had made a stew, with the fish he had brought from the market, and some root vegetables, and a handful of herbs. They ate in silence, the way people do when they are tired and content. The rain began again, tapping on the thatch. Thomas sat by the fire, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes half closed. He did not think of anything in particular. He just was. And that, my listener, is another day in the life of a tanner. Not exciting, not dramatic, just a day like 1,000 others. But in that ordinary day, there is a shape, a pattern, like the carving on Alice's belt. It is not important to the world, but it is important to the man who lived it. Now, let me take you a little further into the year. The winter came early that year, with a hard frost that lasted for weeks. The river froze solid, and Thomas could not work the pits. The water in the tanning vats turned to ice, and the hides became stiff and brittle. He had to wait. He spent his days in the cottage, repairing tools, cutting bark, doing small tasks that did not require the river. He was restless. The work was in his bones, and when he could not do it, he felt a kind of ache, a hollow place inside. But he found other things to keep his hands busy. He made a new pair of shoes for himself, cutting the leather and stitching it with waxed thread. He used a curved needle, the same kind his father had used. The stitches were even and tight. He shaped the sole from a piece of thick cowhide, and he nailed it with small iron nails. He worked slowly, carefully, because a shoe that is rushed will not last. When he finished, he put them on and walked around the cottage. They were stiff, but they would soften with wear. He was satisfied. Alice spent the winter weaving. She had a loom set up in the corner of the room. and she wove cloth from flax that she had grown herself. The loom clacked and thumped, a sound like a heartbeat. Thomas would sit and listen to it, the rhythm of the shuttle, the beating of the reed. It was a counterpoint to his own work, a different kind of making, but just as ancient. He would look at her hands moving, and he would think about how much they had built together, this life of theirs. One evening, a neighbor came to the door, a farmer named John. He brought a cowhide that he had salted and saved all summer. He wanted Thomas to tan it, to make it into leather for a new harness. Thomas looked at the hide. It was a good hide, thick and well salved, but it was large. It would take time, and the pits were frozen. He told John he would start as soon as the thaw came. John nodded, and he left a small payment, a few eggs and a measure of grain. Thomas thanked him. It was the way of the village, one hand helping another. The thaw came in February, slowly at first. A warm wind blew from the south, and the ice began to crack. The river swelled with meltwater, and the pits filled again. Thomas went out early, breaking the remaining ice with a long pole, watching the gray water flow. He lowered John's hide into the liming pit, weighted it with stones. The work had begun again. By spring, the hide was ready. Thomas took it out, scraped it clean, and put it into the tanning pit with fresh bark. He left it for several weeks, turning it regularly, checking the color. The leather took on a deep reddish brown, the color of oak leaves in autumn. When it was done, he dried it slowly, stretching it on a frame. The leather was firm but supple, perfect for a harness. John came to collect it. He ran his hand over the surface, felt the strength of it. He paid Thomas in silver a few coins, and he also brought a leg of mutton, roasted the night before. They shared it that evening, Thomas and Alice, eating the meat with their fingers, the fat running down their chins. It was a feast, and the years went on like that, one season folding into the next. Thomas tanned hides for saddles, for shoes, for bags, for belts, for book covers, for drum heads, for water bottles, for whatever was needed. He learned to make parchment from sheepskin, a delicate process that required careful scraping and stretching. He sold it to the monastery, where the monks used it to write their books. He did not know what they wrote, but he liked the thought of his leather-carrying words across the centuries. He grew older, and his hands grew slower. Richard took on more of the work. The boy was a man now, tall and broad, with the same patient eyes as Thomas. He had learned the trade well. Thomas watched him work, and he felt a quiet pride. The craft would continue. It would outlast him. One summer evening, Thomas sat outside the cottage, watching the sunset. The sky was pink and orange, and the river was gold. Alice was inside, humming a tune. Richard had gone to the village. The flies were buzzing, but they did not bother him anymore. He had made his peace with them. He thought about the leather he had made, all the thousands of hides, all the years. He thought about the smell, the cold water, the endless work. He did not regret any of it. He closed his eyes, and he let the sounds wash over him. The river, the birds, the distant bark of a dog. The world was still there, turning. He was still there, breathing. And that was enough. And so, my listener, I leave you here, on this quiet evening by the river. You may wonder what happened to Thomas, whether he lived to be old, whether his leather is still remembered. But that is not the point. The point is the life itself, the days and the nights, the work and the rest. The point is the smell of the oak bark and the feel of the wet hide, the weight of the coins in the hand, and the taste of the honey bought at market. That is the story, and it continues as long as someone remembers, as long as someone sits by a fire and thinks about the tanner by the river. So let your thoughts drift. Let the images settle. There is no rush. The tanner is patient, and so is the river. And so, perhaps, are you. And so, my listener, I invite you to stay a little longer with Thomas. Let us follow him into the spring of another year, when the world is waking and the river is rising. The ice has gone, and the willows along the bank are showing their first pale leaves. The air is soft, and the smell of the earth is thick and good. Thomas is at the pits again, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his hands in the cold water. He is checking the hides he sank in the autumn. They are ready, he thinks. He pulls one up, feels the grain, smells it. It is done. The leather is dark and plump, full of the tree, full of the time. He lays it on the grass, then another, and another. The pile grows, and he is satisfied. This is the moment he works for, the moment when the months of waiting and turning and scraping and soaking become something real. He calls Richard over, and they lift the heavy leather onto the frame, stretching it, smoothing it with their hands. The water drips from it, running in long streaks down the grass. The sun comes out from behind a cloud, and the leather gleams, a deep, rich brown, almost black in the shadows. Thomas runs his hand over it, and he feels the future. He sees the shoes it will become, the belts, the bags, the saddles. He sees the feet that will walk in it, the hands that will hold it. It is a strange kind of sight to look at a piece of leather and see so many lives. But Thomas has it. Later that day, a cart comes down the lane. It is the monk from the monastery, a round-faced man with a gentle smile. His name is Brother Michael, and he comes twice a year to buy parchment. Thomas has a pile ready, sheets of smooth, pale sheepskin, carefully scraped and dried. Brother Michael examines them, holding them up to the light, checking for flaws. He nods. He pays Thomas in silver, and he also brings a gift, a small book of hours, handwritten on parchment. The letters are small and neat, with red initials painted at the beginning of each page. Thomas cannot read, but he loves the look of the letters, the way they flow across the page like water. Alice can read a little, taught by the monks when she was a girl, and she reads aloud to Thomas sometimes. That evening, she opens the book and reads him a psalm. The words are old and strange, but they settle something in him, something deep and quiet. He thinks about the sheep that grew the skin, and the grass the sheep ate, and the sun that shone on the grass. He thinks about his hands scraping the skin, stretching it, making it smooth. And now the words. It is a chain, he thinks, a chain of making and meaning. The sheep, the grass, the sun, his hands, the monk's words. It is all connected. He does not know how to say it, but he feels it. He sits by the fire, the book in his lap, his fingers tracing the letters without understanding them. Alice smiles at him. She knows what he is feeling. The spring turns to summer. The days grow long and hot. The smell of the tanning pits grows stronger, but Thomas does not notice. He is used to it. The flies return, thick and buzzing, but he swats them away without anger. He has made his peace with them. Richard works beside him now, and they talk little, but the silence is comfortable. The water, the flies, the endless work, it is the rhythm of their lives. One morning, a stranger comes to the cottage. He is a man from the city, a merchant who has heard of Thomas's leather. He wants to buy a large quantity, all Thomas can make, for saddles and boots. He offers a good price, coins that Thomas has never seen before, silver pennies and gold nobles. Thomas looks at them, weighs them in his hand. They are heavy, real, but he thinks about the work. He is an old man now, and Richard does most of the heavy lifting. Can they make enough for the merchant? He looks at Richard, and Richard nods. They will try. The merchant agrees to come back in the autumn. Thomas sets to work with a new energy. He buys more hides from the farmers, more bark from the woodcutters. The pits fill up. The river works its magic. Thomas and Richard spend long days in the yard, scraping and turning and smoothing. They work until their hands are raw and their backs ache. But they do not complain. This is what they do. And in the evenings, Thomas sits by the fire, exhausted but content. Alice brings him a cup of ale, and he drinks it slowly. She tells him about the day, about the chickens and the garden and the neighbor who had a baby. He listens, nodding. These small things, these ordinary things, they are the fabric of his life. He holds them close. The autumn comes, and the merchant returns. He looks at the stack of leather, the deep brown hides, the smooth black ones, the pale gold ones. He runs his hand over them. He smiles. He pays Thomas the full price, and he orders more for the spring. Thomas takes the coins, heavy in his pocket. He does not know what he will do with them all. He has everything he needs, but he is glad that his work is valued, glad that the chain continues. He buys a new cloak for Alice, a fine wool cloak dyed a deep blue. He buys a new knife for Richard, a good steel blade with a bone handle. He buys himself a small bag of sweetmeats, a rare treat. They have a feast that night, with fresh bread and cheese and the sweetmeats. They laugh, the three of them, sitting around the flickering candle. It is a good life, Thomas thinks, a hard life, but good. And so the years pass, one after another, like the seasons. Thomas grows older, his back bends, his hands knot with age. He cannot work as he used to. He spends more time sitting by the fire, watching Richard do the work. He gives advice, sometimes, but mostly he just watches. He is happy to see the craft continue. One winter, Thomas falls ill. A cough takes hold of him, and he cannot shake it. He lies in bed, the blankets pulled up to his chin. The fire crackles in the hearth. Alice sits beside him, holding his hand. She speaks softly, telling him stories, reading from the Book of Hours. Thomas listens, his eyes closed. He can feel the warmth of her hand, the rhythm of her voice. He is not afraid. He thinks about the river, the way it flows, always moving, always changing, yet always the same. He thinks about the leather, the way it holds its shape, the way it softens with use, the way it lasts. He thinks about his hands, the hands that have held so many wet hides, the hands that have made so many things. He feels a strange peace. One morning, he does not wake. Richard finds him still and quiet, a faint smile on his face. Alice does not weep. She sits with him a while, then she goes to the cottage door and looks out at the river. The sun is just rising, turning the water to gold. She remembers the day she first saw Thomas, standing by the pits, his hands in the water. She remembers the smell, the flies. She remembers the way he looked at her. She smiles, a small, sad smile. Richard carries Thomas to the churchyard, and they bury him under an oak tree. The priest says the words, but Richard does not hear them. He is thinking about the leather, the thousands of hides his father tanned, the thousands more he will tan himself. The chain continues. It will not break. And so, my listener, the story of Thomas the tanner does not end. It becomes part of the river, part of the oak bark, part of the leather. It becomes part of the shoes you might wear, the belt you might buckle, the book you might hold. It is there, if you know where to look. It is in the smell of rain on old leather, the feel of a well-worn saddle, the quiet patience of a man at work. Let your mind rest now. Let the images fade like the evening light. The tanner is at peace, and so is his river. And so, perhaps, are you. Drift a little longer. Let the story settle. There is no need to hold on. The water flows, the seasons turn, and the leather grows strong. Sleep, my listener, sleep. But wait, there is still a little more to tell. A story cannot truly end, can it? It only pauses, like a runner catching his breath. So let me take you back to that cottage by the river, a few years after Thomas was buried under the oak tree. The seasons have rolled on, and Richard has become the master tanner. He works the pits with the same quiet patience his father had, the same steady hands. The cottage feels different now, emptier, but Alice remains. She sits by the fire in the evenings, the book of hours open on her lap, her fingers tracing the painted letters. She reads aloud to herself, the words filling the silence. Sometimes she stops and looks at the door, as if expecting Thomas to walk in, his hands wet, his face tired and content. But the door stays shut. She puts the book down, stirs the fire, and waits for the morning light. Richard works alone now, though he has hired a young boy from the village to help with the heavy hides. The boy is lean and eager, with a shock of red hair and a laugh that echoes across the yard. His name is Peter, and he asks endless questions. Richard answers slowly, pointing at the pits, explaining the right kind of bark, the right amount of time. Peter nods, but his mind wanders. He watches the river, the way the light dances on the water. Richard does not scold him. He remembers being young, remembers how the world seemed so wide and bright. Let the boy dream, he thinks. The leather will wait. The years pass, a soft and steady current. Alice grows older, her hair turning white as the winter frost. She still tends the garden, though her back aches, and she must sit more often. She plants lavender and rosemary, the same herbs her mother planted. The smell drifts into the cottage, mixing with the bark and the river water. It reminds her of Thomas, of his hands, his voice, the way he held her at night. She does not weep. Weeping is for the young. Instead, she hums old songs, songs from her childhood, songs the monks taught her. The tunes are simple, almost forgotten, but they carry her through the days. One afternoon in high summer, a cart rolls down the lane, loaded with hides from a distant farm. The farmer is new, a young man with a thin beard and nervous eyes. He says the market town is too far, that the old roads are full of bandits. He asks Richard to take the hides at a reduced price, just to be rid of them. Richard examines the skins. They are good, thick, and clean. He haggles a little, not out of greed, but out of habit. They settle on a fair price. The farmer smiles, a quick, nervous smile, and leaves. Richard watches the cart disappear around the bend, and he feels a flicker of pride. The business continues. His father's name is still spoken with respect in the county. That same week, Brother Michael arrives again, older now, his round face lined with age. He carries a new book, a gift for Alice. It is a collection of saints' lives, written in a hand so small, and even it seems miraculous. Alice takes it with trembling hands. She opens it, and the smell of ink and parchment floods her senses. She reads a little aloud, her voice soft and halting. Richard listens from the door, a hide draped over his arm. The words are about a saint who lived in the desert, who worked with his hands, who knew the value of simple labor. Richard thinks of Thomas. He smiles. But change is coming, as it always does. A new road is being built, a wider road that will bring carts from the city more quickly. A mill is being built upstream, a great wheel that will grind grain faster than any hand could. People talk of progress, of better days. Richard does not understand all of it, but he feels it in the air. The price of bark rises. The farmers sell their hides to the city merchants now, bypassing the small tanners. Richard must pay more for his raw materials, and his profit shrinks. He worries, but he does not show it. He works harder longer. Peter helps him dig a new pit, deeper than the old ones, lined with stone. It takes weeks of back-breaking labor, but when it is finished, Richard feels a quiet satisfaction. The water in the new pit holds its temperature longer. The leather cures more evenly. It is a small victory, but a real one. One evening, a stranger arrives on horseback, a young man in fine clothes, a merchant from the city. He has heard of the quality of Richard's leather. He wants to buy an entire year's production, all of it, for the army. There is a war, he explains, a war far to the east, and the soldiers need boots and saddles and straps. The price is high, higher than Richard has ever seen. He looks at the silver coins, gleaming in the candlelight. But he thinks of the work, the endless days of scraping and soaking and stretching. He thinks of his father, who never worked for armies, only for the quiet needs of the village. He hesitates. The merchant grows impatient. He has other places to go, other tanners to see. Richard takes a breath. He tells the merchant that he will prepare what he can, but he will not promise the full year. The merchant grumbles, but he leaves a deposit, a handful of silver. Richard holds it in his palm. It feels heavy, cold. He does not know if he has made the right choice. That night, Richard sits by the fire with Alice. She is knitting a pair of wool socks, her needles clicking softly. He tells her about the merchant, about the war, about the silver. She listens, her eyes on her work. When he finishes, she looks up. She says only one word, Thomas. Then she goes back to her knitting. And Richard understands. His father would not have liked the war leather. He would have wanted to make the things that lasted, that mattered. Boots for a farmer, a saddle for a priest, a strap for a cradle. Not for war. Richard decides. He will return the silver. He will keep his small life. The days grow shorter. The leaves turn gold and red, falling into the river and swirling away. Richard collects the bark from the oak trees, stripping it in long strips, stacking it in the shed. The smell of wet bark fills the air, sharp and earthy. Peter helps him, and they work in silence. The only sounds the scrape of the knife and the rustle of the leaves. It is a good rhythm, a peaceful one. Then, one morning in late autumn, Richard does not wake when the rooster crows. Peter finds him in his bed, his face calm, his hands at his sides. He has passed in his sleep, just like his father. Alice is the one who weeps now, a quiet, steady weeping that lasts all day. She sits by his bed, holding his hand, remembering the small boy who helped his father scrape the first hides, the young man who took over the pits, the old man who never stopped working. She thinks of all that leather, all those hands, all those years. The village priest comes. He says the words. Richard is buried beside Thomas, under the same oak tree. The leaves fall on the grave, and the river murmurs its old song. Peter stands at the foot of the grave, his red hair wild in the wind. He does not know what to do now. He is only a boy, and the master is gone. Alice comes to him, places a hand on his cheek. She tells him that the cottage and the pits are his now, if he wants them. He can become the tanner. He can carry the chain. Peter looks at the river, at the pits, at the leather stacked in the shed. He remembers Richard's patience, his quiet lessons, the way he showed him how to feel the grain of the hide. He remembers Thomas's voice from stories Richard told about the river and the bark and the endless work. He nods. He will stay. And so the chain does not break. Peter learns as Richard learned, as Thomas learned. He makes mistakes as they did. He wastes a hide, soaking it too long, and the leather comes out brittle, useless. He curses, then remembers Richard's calm voice. He tries again. He learns the patience of the water. Years pass, and Peter grows into a man. He marries a girl from the village, a quiet girl with steady hands. She helps him with the scraping, with the drying, with the record keeping. They have children, a boy and a girl. The boy shows interest in the pits, splashing in the water, watching his father work. The girl prefers the garden with Alice's old herbs. The cottage is full of noise again, full of life. The world changes around them. The new road brings more travelers, more merchants, more stories. A man passes through, a pilgrim on his way to a distant shrine. He tells them about a great cathedral being built, with stained glass windows and towering spires. Peter listens, fascinated. He has never seen such a building. He knows only the small stone church in the village, the one with the cracked bell. But the pilgrim's words paint pictures in his mind. One winter, a terrible storm comes. The river rises, swelling beyond its banks, flooding the pits. Peter works all night, trying to save the hides, but many are lost. He stands in the freezing water, his hands numb, his heart heavy. The boy, now a young man, helps him. They salvage what they can. When the sun rises, the water subsides. The pits are filled with mud, the leather ruined. Peter leans on a shovel, exhausted. He thinks of giving up. But then he thinks of Thomas, of Richard, of all the years of work. He starts cleaning the pits. It takes months to recover. The merchant who promised the army has long gone, but local farmers still bring their hides. The boy, Thomas's great-grandson, named after the old tanner, takes on more responsibility. He has a natural gift for the craft, a feeling for the right texture, the right time. Peter watches him with quiet pride. The chain is strong. And so the story of the tanners by the river continues through generations, through wars and storms and quiet seasons. The oak trees grow old and are cut down, but new ones grow in their place. The river changes course, slowly, over centuries, but the water never stops flowing. The smell of the pits, the flies, the endless work, it all remains. The leather becomes shoes and belts and book covers and saddles. It holds the weight of the world. Now, my listener, it is time to let go. The story is not really over. It never is. It lives on in the leather you might touch tomorrow, in the pages of a book, in the feel of a well-worn shoe. But for tonight, let the river carry you. Let the oak bark settle. Let the tanner's hands rest. Close your eyes. Breathe. Sleep, my listener, sleep. And yet, even as sleep begins to settle over you, the river does not stop. The water still runs past the old tannery, though the building itself has long since crumbled. The stones of the pits were taken, one, by farmers who needed foundations for their barns. The oak tree that shaded Thomas and Richard and Peter was struck by lightning one summer night, and its trunk lay across the stream for years, moss-covered, slowly sinking into the mud. Children played on it, pretending it was a bridge to a faraway kingdom. No one remembers the tanners now, but the river remembers. It carries the memory of their hands, their sweat, their patience. If you walk that path today, on a quiet autumn afternoon, you might notice something strange. A patch of ground near the old bank, darker than the rest, still smelling faintly of bark and something deeper, something ancient. The locals call it the tanner's earth. They say if you dig there, you will find scraps of leather, black and stiff, that crumble at the touch. A shoemaker from the next village once tried to use a piece, but it fell apart in his hands. Too old, he said. Too much time. But he kept a tiny scrap anyway, tucked inside his workbench, a reminder of something he could not name. The craft itself changed, of course. By the time the great machines arrived, the pits were already abandoned. The new tanneries used chemicals that worked faster, cleaner, without the smell of the river. They produced leather in days, not months. But the old tanners, the ones who worked by the water, they knew something the machines could never learn. They knew the patience of the oak, the slow conversation between hide and bark and time. They knew that leather, like a person, needs to rest. It needs to breathe. It needs to wait. And so, in a way, the work never really ended. It only transformed. The leather you wear today, the belt that holds your trousers, the soles of your shoes, the cover of a book you might read by candlelight tonight, all of it carries a whisper from those early pits. A whisper of hands that scraped and soaked and stretched, of backs that ached, of feet that stood in cold water for hours. The tanners are gone, but their touch remains. The boy Peter, the one with the red hair, he lived to be an old man. He never left the village. He taught his son, and his son taught his son, and so it went down through the centuries. The last of the line, a woman named Alina, died in the 1920s, just before the First World War. She was 90 years old, blind, but still able to tell by feel whether a hide was ready. She had no children, and the pits were filled with rubble by then. She lived alone in a small cottage that smelled of dust and old memories. On her deathbed, she asked for a piece of leather to hold. The nurse found a scrap, a leftover from her father's time, and placed it in her hand. Alina smiled, and then she was gone. The cottage was torn down, the land plowed under for a field of wheat. Every spring, the farmer who owns the field notices that the wheat grows taller and greener in one particular spot, the place where the pits once lay. He does not know why. He just accepts it, as farmers do, and moves on. So you see, the chain did not break. It simply faded, like the smell of bark on a still evening. But the leather remains in the covers of old books, in the bindings of ancient manuscripts, in the shoes that walked to market and back, in the saddles that carried knights and farmers and pilgrims. Each piece holds a story, a memory of the river, the bark, the endless work. Now, truly, it is time to let go. The fire has burned low. The candle flickers. The night is deep and still. Let the tanners rest. Let the river flow in your dreams, dark and slow, carrying the scent of oak and wet earth. Let your hands be still, your breath soft, your heart quiet. There is no more work tonight. Only the water, the endless water, murmuring its old song. Sleep, my listener, sleep.